All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up a clinical investigation into one of the toughest complications out there, burn wound infections. We're going to dive deep, looking at everything from the wound itself to tracking down the microbial culprits and figuring out the absolute best ways to fight back.
So here's our game plan for this investigation. First, we'll start at the scene of the crime, the burn wound itself. Then we'll get into the forensic work of identifying our microbial suspects. After that, we'll go over the treatment arsenal we have at our disposal before opening a specific case file on a very notorious pathogen. And finally, we'll look at what happens when things escalate and the serious consequences that can follow.
So let's start right at the source. A burn does more than just damage tissue. It fundamentally destroys the body's most important protective shield, our skin. And that creates a wide open door for infection.
You know, you can think of healthy skin as this incredible fortress wall. A burn doesn't just punch a hole in it. It actually creates this warm, nutrient-rich, and defenseless environment that's basically a perfect breeding ground for microbes. It's this unique vulnerability that makes these infections so incredibly common and, frankly, so dangerous.
Now, clinically, when we're looking for trouble, we're really watching for two kinds of clues. First, you have the local signs, right there at the wound site itself. Things like worsening pain, erythema, which is that redness and inflammation you see, swelling, and of course, the formation of pus. But if that infection isn't stopped, it starts to trigger systemic alarms all over the body. We're talking fever, chills, that general sick feeling, all of which can be a slippery slope right into life-threatening sepsis.
So, once those systemic alarms start going off, our investigation pivots. We move right into the forensics workup to figure out exactly which pathogens are causing the problem. And this part is absolutely critical, because what we find here is going to dictate our entire game plan.
The key thing to remember is that getting an accurate ID is all about meticulous evidence collection. You see, just swabbing the surface, it's almost useless, honestly. It's totally misleading because you just pick up whatever's living on the skin. To find the real culprit, you have to clean the surface and then go deep. Get a tissue sample either by aspirating it with a needle or taking a small biopsy. That's how you get the true story of what's really brewing inside that wound.
Okay, so this is basically our most wanted list of microbial suspects. Early on, in an acute burn, our prime suspects are almost always Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes. If you're dealing with really large wounds, you start thinking about gram-negatives, like Pseudomonas. Then, if the wound becomes chronic or the patient's been on a lot of antibiotics, you might see fungal invaders like Candida pop up. And of course, in the ICU setting, you're up against the really tough, multi-drug-resistant bugs like Acinetobacter. Each one has its own modus operandi.
All right, so once we've identified our suspects and we have their susceptibility reports back, we can finally deploy a targeted response. And we're not just throwing pills at the problem here. This is a two-pronged attack, surgical and pharmacological.
And this is a hard and fast rule, something we absolutely have to start with. If you have any kind of pus collection, any abscess, antibiotics alone are doomed to fail. The pus creates this acidic, oxygen-poor environment, this physical barrier that drugs just can't get through. So surgical incision and drainage isn't just a suggestion, it is the absolute critical first move to get control.
After we've handled drainage, then we pick our antibiotic. For a simple superficial ulcer, something like oral flucloxacillin is a great first choice, since it targets our usual suspects, staph and strep. But if you're dealing with a really severe, necrotizing infection where you suspect nasty resistant bugs like Pseudomonas, you have to escalate immediately to heavy-hitting IV agents like meropenem. But even these powerful drugs have trouble getting into pus. I guess you could say they're not very good at getting into sticky situations.
Okay, so let's zoom in on our prime suspect, Staphylococcus aureus. To make sure we've really got this down, we're going to walk through 3 key questions about how we manage it.
So first question for you. When you walk up to an infected burn wound, who should be at the very top of your suspect list? What are the most common bacterial culprits?
And as we've talked about, while things like fungi can show up later on, the primary bacterial bad guys in an acute burn are, time and again, Staphylococcus aureus and hemolytic streptococci. Any initial therapy has to cover them.
All right, next up, let's really hammer this home.
If you see an abscess, a collection of pus on that burn wound, what is your #1 most critical move even before thinking about antibiotics?
You got it! It's surgical incision and drainage. This just reinforces that core principle. Antibiotics can't work their magic if they can't get to the bugs. You have to remove the pus first.
Okay, last one. Let's talk about what happens when this thing goes systemic. If Staph aureus breaks out of the wound and gets into the bloodstream, what is a really feared complication, one that we worry about especially in children?
That's right, osteomyelitis. When S. aureus is in the blood, it can set up these secondary infection sites anywhere in the body. And in kids, for reasons we're still figuring out, it has this dangerous habit of settling in the long bones, causing a really severe and tough-to-treat bone infection.
You know, that last question is the perfect lead-in to our final topic, the systemic fallout. This is what happens when that local infection gets out of control, and believe me, the consequences can be absolutely devastating.
And let's not mince words here. The stakes are incredibly high. Staphylococcus aureus bacteriumi, when it comes from a burn wound, is not some minor issue. It carries a significant high fatality rate. So keeping that infection contained at the source is, quite literally, a matter of life and death.
So why is it so deadly? Well, it's because these bacteria can essentially hitch a ride in the bloodstream and seed new infections absolutely anywhere. This can lead to abscesses in the kidneys or lungs, osteomyelitis in the bones, or one of the most dreaded complications of all, endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves themselves, which can then launch tiny infected clots to the brain or other organs.
And that really brings us to the big final question, the one we all have to grapple with. We've just laid out the classic clinical investigation, but our suspects, the pathogens, are constantly evolving. They're getting smarter, developing resistance to our best drugs. So the critical question for the future is this: how do our forensic techniques, our surveillance, and our treatment strategies need to adapt and evolve to stay one step ahead of these incredibly dangerous organisms? That's the challenge for all of us.